One, IEEE-RAS is excited to present to you Tech Talk 3 on the topic Design Optimization of Soft Wearable Assistive Devices. A warm and hearty welcome to our guest and speaker of the evening, Dr. Sagar Joshi. Dr. Joshi has done his bachelor's degree from Sardar Patel College of Engineering, Mumbai, and he has completed his master's from IIT Bombay. He has done his doctoral studies from Ecole Polytechnique, Federale de Lausanne, where he worked on a thesis on the topic Design and Dynamic Analysis of soft pneumatic systems for wearable robots. He is currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Delft University of Technology at TU Delft, and his research is based on design, modeling, and optimization of exosuits for human upper arm. We at IEEE-RAS feel very blessed and honored by your presence, sir. Thank you so much for joining in for the event.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Cool. First of all, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the welcome. Just before the talk, let me start with like you can just call me by my first name. You can say Sagar. There's no need for Sir or Dr. Joshi or anything like that. Because to me now it feels very odd, especially because here it's a very informal based system. Like I always call my professors by the first name. Doesn't matter how old he is. So it's a different culture. So now I'm more used to that. So during the talk or after, if you have questions and so on, please just say Sagar. And let me try to see if I can share my screen. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, and oh, wait a second. And now do you see like the presentation mode or do you see the actual presentation at the moment?
Sir, the
Oh, actually, let
presentation.
me stop and try again because I think it changes when I do something. I think this should work now. Yeah, I think this should work.
Yes, sir, it's perfect.
Nice. All right. Okay. Cool. So today I will try to talk about mostly the work that I did during my PhD. Um, and the title of my talk will be Design Optimization of Soft Wearable Assistive Devices. So let me try to explain what these different things mean. All right. So now, generally, when we think of robotics, what comes to mind are these kinds of rigid industrial machines, which are generally used in assembly lines, which can perform repetitive tasks with high speed, force, and precision, and so on. But now, over the years, the field of robotics has expanded itself to many other domains, and one of them that I will talk about today is about wearable robots. So the general idea is that these kinds of robots are amazing at what they do, but they are not really great at working in close proximity to humans. But now, since we are looking at several different applications, some of these applications require robots to be very close to the humans. In fact, almost to be placed on the humans. And these kind of robots are called wearable robots. So just a brief introduction. Wearable robots are robots that you can wear. They are directly attached on the body to assist or augment the function of the body. But why do we need these kind of robots? So you can have some kind of workers in industries who have to work a lot with manual material labor, like lifting things or working with their hands a lot, lifting tools and operating tools and so on. So for those people, you can have some kind of devices that you can wear, which can take off some of the load of the muscles of the body, Similarly, for people who have lost some of their physical abilities, you could use these to restore some of the functions and help them in activities of daily living, which is ADL. You could also use these kind of robots for sports training. Like some of you might be aware that resistance training is some kind of thing where you try to put on more weights on yourself while doing a particular activity and so on. Or you could just be curious about how the body works and you're trying to see what if we apply external forces on the body, what would happen to the movement, and the human motor control and so on. So now, over the years, there have been several different kinds of robots that have been built, um, that have been placed on different parts of the body to assist different parts. They can be briefly categorized into two main categories. One is known as rigid exoskeletons, or these ones are known as exoskeletons, which exo means external, skeleton means a skeleton. The main idea is that these consist of a traditional robotic body with a rigid structure, which has rigid links connected at well-defined joints. The advantage of these kind of devices is that we already know a lot about how to build these systems and how to operate them and how to model them and so on. The problem, however, lies in the fact that the joints of the body are not perfectly rotational joints. If you look at the motion of, let's say, the ankle or the knee or even the wrist, the elbow, and so on, it doesn't always move perfectly across like one single axis of rotation. It's always accompanied by some kind of translation and rotation at the same time. Plus, you have motion of the skin, and so on. And so there is some kind of incompatibility between the motion of the robot and the motion of the human. And this leads to additional forces that act on the body, and that can cause some kind of discomfort or even pain. Secondly, since these robots require a rigid frame, they're usually large, heavy, and bulky, and also, of course, costly. So, in the recent, uh, I would say, in the past decade almost, there's been a new approach towards building wearable robots, which is by using soft materials. These devices are called exosuits, suits because they are kind of like functional garments that you can wear, and then these garments can apply some kind of forces on the body, and they can assist the person in doing different tasks. Now, the benefits of this kind of design is that since the materials used for the robots is soft, these are compliant and conformable, so they adapt very well to different people. They adapt very well to the motion of the human. So there's kinematic compatibility between the device and the human. And since it doesn't require a heavy frame, these are lightweight, and these can be completely transparent when inactive. So you just switch off the power supply and they will act as just a piece of cloth. You can see from this figure that the number of publications in soft wearable robots has been steadily increasing over the past decade. Uh, the different type of soft wearable robots that you can have, are the um, four types mentioned here, with McKibben muscles, elastomers, fabric-based actuators, and cable-driven actuators. Among these, three of these are powered by pneumatics, and that is the reason why I focused on pneumatic systems during my PhD. So just to give a brief idea of what pneumatically powered soft robots mean, it's systems like this. The general idea is that these robots are kind of hollow structures with some kind of mechanical intelligence built into their design. So when you inflate them, they inflate in certain specific direction and certain specific ways to create some kind of motion, and that can be pre-programmed into the design of the device. So the two devices you see here are, one is an extending actuator and one is a bending actuator. And then this is my third video is yeah. And then the third one is just a kind of like a bulging type pouch based actuator. So we call them soft pneumatic actuators. Now, From the name, these are pneumatic actuators. So for pneumatics, you need a pneumatic system. Just to give a brief summary, pneumatic systems or pneumatic supply systems consist of like a source which generates the pressurized gas. It consists of valves that control how the pressurized gas is sent to the actuators, or how the actuators can be inflated or deflated and so on. And then the pneumatic lines which connect the different components. So using these kinds of soft pneumatic actuators, you can see that there's several kinds of robots, wearable robots that have already been developed, from the wrist to the ankle. There's numerous applications where these already have been used. So you can see that these are highly versatile. Then because air by itself is compressible, you have some kind of inherent compliance. So it's not like a rigid robot which will move to an angle and then be very rigid at that point. Because of the compressibility of the air, you can still move the actuator and it won't force the person to stay at a specific position. Additionally, since these are by nature expanding type actuators, the forces that they apply on the body are generally normal to the skin. Now, this is a very commonly observed challenge in wearable robots in general, that the forces that are applied on the skin, if they act shear to the skin, like if they act tangential to the skin, it causes a lot of discomfort. Whereas if it acts normal to the skin, comparatively, that is much more bearable. So, by nature of soft pneumatic actuators, these produce normal type forces on the body. The now next step that we have to think is that, okay, we have these soft actuators which are good for several reasons. We can build wearable robots with them, but that's not the only thing. There's a lot of things that we have to think through in between. We need to think about how the soft actuators will behave. So what will be their dynamic performance? How will they move? How will the different forces be applied? As well as the core supporting systems, mainly the power, sensing, and control. Additionally, we need ways to evaluate how wearable robots will affect the user. So this can be done in terms of portability, wearability, which defines like the comfort, and then biomechanics, which means how the actuator affects the muscles of the body, or the joint movements and joint loading of the body and so on. At the moment, or let's say when I began my PhD, there were significant research gaps in all of them. So the objective of my PhD was to kind of try to understand the link between these different blocks, and develop a more core understanding of how soft actuators work and how they can be used for wearable robots. So among that, today I will talk about modeling the dynamic behavior of soft pneumatic actuators, and then how soft wearable robots affect the user. So generally, when we are thinking about research, or a kind of a research problem, you have to come up with a research question. So the first research question for the first problem is, how do pneumatic systems affect the dynamic behavior of soft actuators? So, like I had mentioned once before, pneumatic supply systems consist of source, valve, pneumatic lines. Um, and the dynamic response of an actuator is governed by these three factors. Now, just to clarify this a bit more, when you're wearing some kind of a device and you are trying to, let's say you're wearing an assistive glove and you want to reach out and pick up, let's say, a glass on the table. You need to move your hand there, and then you need to power the actuator, and then the actuator needs to uh, close the grasp within a certain amount of time. You can't have it moving very slowly for, let's say, 5 or 10 seconds. So the idea here is that generally the requirements of speed are specified for a given application. And so you need to somehow control your system so as to meet that speed. But previous studies that worked with soft pneumatic actuators in general did not know what is the link between the pneumatic system that you have and then the kind of dynamic performance that you get. Dynamic means how fast you can move the actuators. So to address this, During my PhD, I worked on a generalized model for the pneumatic supply system, in which I tried to model these different components of a source, the valve, the pneumatic line, reservoirs, and so on. At the end, the model had over 12 different parameters, and I tried to investigate how these 12 parameters affect the dynamic response. And then after simulations, I tested my simulation results experimentally using over 170 different combinations of different parameter values. So just to say as an example, it's actually the next slide would be helpful. All right, so here you have a soft bending type actuator, and then the four figures you see that it is moving at different speeds. It's moving at different speeds because it's being powered by different source pressures. Now, the important thing to note here is that the actuator is always powered from 0 to 50 kilopascals. So even though the source pressure here is almost 400 kilopascals, here the source pressure is 400 kilopascals. If you power the actuator at this value, the actuator will burst because it can't take more than say 60 or 70. So you have to make sure to power it so that the actuator pressure goes from 0 to 50 and then switch it off right away. But in all these four cases, the actuator is being powered at the same pressure level, but you see different speeds because the source pressure is at a much higher value in this one as compared to this one. And the two figures on the right, you can see the comparison between the prediction from the model and then the actual measured data. It was pressurized from 0 to 100 kilopascals. Sorry, my bad. Anyway, so from here the dotted line was the measured, and the continuous line was from the model, and you can see that the model matches experimental results really well. So what does this mean? It means that you can use this model to predict how the actuator will behave, how fast it will move, in what pattern it will move, based on my model and based on the parameters. So now you kind of have a link between pneumatic system and soft actuator performance. What you can do now is go in the inverse way and then use this relationship to kind of like optimize pneumatic systems. Um, so previously, what used to happen is that to design pneumatic systems, people used to just select some compressor, select some valve, some reservoir value, or some source pressure, and so on. And so it was very heuristic. It's like you do it from experience, or you do it by trying several times, and then you somewhat find something that works for you. But it was not really optimized for anything. Furthermore, if you change the actuator, if you change your valve, or if you change any other component, you require to retune the whole model, or you need to retune um, some other components to make sure that you get the kind of performance that you need. But now, by using my model and the simulations, you can optimize the pneumatic system to meet exactly the kind of requirements that you specify. And this can be done in terms of dynamic performance, of course, but also in terms of the portability of the system. So how much air and energy is consumed, or how much air or energy is available to you. So in some examples, let's say you have a battery powered device, and you need to allow it to go somewhere away from the setup, or away from humans. So you need to be sure that your soft robot can go up to that point without completely draining its battery. So what do you do in that case? You can optimize the different components using this model, and optimize also how much battery you need and so on, so that you'll have a device that will last for the desired intent. Um, so using this, um, I I validated this method by building a kind of a wearable and portable pneumatic supply system with minimum weight of components. And the requirement there was to meet the performance requirements and the predicted pressure response. So I specified that my actuator needs to deflate within 0.75 seconds and needs to inflate within 0.4 seconds. And the objective was to come up with these set of different components like your compressor valve and so on, um, which would allow my actuator to meet these specifications. So to summarize this part, uh, I worked on a model to quantify the relationship between soft pneumatic actuators and pneumatic supply systems. And then using this model, it is now possible to do design optimization of pneumatic supply systems. There's several further directions which can be taken. For example, there are lots of, mainly there were a lot of assumptions in the study, like the process is isothermal, or the actuator expands linearly with the pressure and so on. But yeah, these could be explored in future directions. Now, the second and also very important aspect of wearable robots is we need to evaluate how do the wearable robots actually affect the user. Now, why do we need to study this? Well, in case of rigid exoskeletons, they have a rigid frame, and so a significant amount of forces that are generated by these robots are already taken up by the frame itself, and so they can be somewhat safe, let's say. In case of soft wearable robots, they are inherently safe because they are compliant and conformable. But if you apply very large forces, there's no rigid frame to take away to support these forces. So all the forces that are applied have to be borne by the wearer. And so it is critical to investigate how these large forces affect the user, especially when sensitive locations like the spine or the torso are concerned. Um, in existing devices, some of the metrics that are used include things like the metabolic rate, cost of transport, heart rate, or the muscle activity, which is measured using surface EMG, or the kinetics and kinematics, and so on. What is not completely studied is how the forces applied by soft exosuits affect the individual muscle fibers and the joint loading of of the wearer. So this was a significant research gap that I found out, that it's not really well known how to model wearable soft wearable devices, and then once you model them, how would they affect the muscles and so on. So I'll skip this part. No, that's fine. Okay, so there's kind of, there were two objectives in this part of my PhD. One was how to design a device that can assist the spine and torso, and second, how to quantify its effect. So to design the soft actuator, the main idea was to use a bending type soft actuator and place it um, between the wearer and a kind of fabric attachment that goes over the top of the actuator. So when the actuator expands, it kind of generates tension in these fabric straps, and then that will kind of like push the person back to the upright position, or depending on what you need. So this was the first design iteration in which the exosuit could provide assistance in forward bending and lateral bending. But the forces that I got from this were comparatively smaller. So I used the same kind of actuation mechanism, but then developed a new version of, or let's say the final version of my exosuit, in which again there's these three um, soft pneumatic actuators which bulge out when you pressurize them. Let me try to play this video. Is it on? Yeah. So when you pressurize it, it just like bulges out. And as it bulges out, it generates tension in these different fabric sections. And because of the tension generated, there is like an overall moment that acts on the torso, which kind of helps to push the person back into upright position. So it kind of consists of three main actuators, one on the chest, one on the back, one on the waist, and it can be like the design was also made to be reconfigurable so that it can assist in different motions. So from the figure C and D, you can see that it can be used for lateral bending support or assistance to like the shoulder elevation. So the idea of this one was that you have one actuator on the back which generates like an extending motion on the spine. Extending means it kind of makes the spine upright from a forward bent posture. One actuator on the waist which applies a moment on the hip joint over here so that it tries to make the hip also vertically upright as opposed to when it is bent forward. And then one actuator at the chest which kind of like acts as a tensioner pulley to generate more tension in these other two sections. So now I built the device. Now we need to evaluate how it affects the user. So to do that, first I measured how much forces are being applied by the actuator, by the exosuit, by placing um, pressure sensing arrays between the actuator and the user. And you can see here that significantly high forces are being applied, almost in the range of 500 newtons. That these are very high forces. This also um, kind of suggests that we need to study how these would affect the user at the end, because uh, if if not studied properly, these could cause some kind of injury to the user if not checked. So how do we evaluate this? We use this. We use a kind of approach called as musculoskeletal modeling. So from the word, you can see that musculo means muscles, skeletal means the skeleton. So musculoskeletal modeling and analysis is a type of method in which you model the human body as a bunch of rigid bodies for different bones and special type of actuators that represent the muscles. And you run that in a kind of a physics engine, and you can apply external forces on the system, and then you can try to find out how it affects the muscle forces or how it affects the loading on the joints of the body. So the software that I used is called OpenSim. I'm not sure if people are aware of this one, but it's an open source musculoskeletal modeling software developed by Stanford, and there's lots of generic models that are available. You just have to take the model and then do some analysis by applying different forces on different points, and then use the tools that it has to kind of see how much forces would be generated in the muscles of the body. Um, so I looked at 6 different muscle groups which are relevant for the torso, and I calculated what would be the predicted muscle forces and the loading on the spine in compressive, shear, and joint moment. So generally, to summarize this quickly, by using the exosuit, you would have 60% reduction in one of the main extensors of the back, like the main muscle of the back. There would be up to 60% reduction. Similarly, there would be reduction in the compressive forces generated in the spine. At the same time, however, there are other effects, mainly that there's a slight increase in the abdominal muscles. So now you can think of the back muscles and the abdominal muscles as acting opposite to each other. When you have an exosuit that is pushing your body behind, the muscles of the abdomen have to kind of counteract against that so that it doesn't push you too much. That's why you see the rise in the abdominal muscles. And also you see there is some amount of increase in the deeper muscles of the spine. Now this is particularly important because usually you can measure some of the muscle activity of the body by placing these kind of EMG sensors on the skin, but they can only measure the activity of the superficial muscles, the muscles which are very close to the skin. But we have different layers of muscles, and then the deeper layers of muscles, it's very difficult to measure the muscle activity of those muscles using these surface EMG sensors. Um, and so essentially, till now, people did not know what is actually happening to the muscles that you have way deep, close to the spine. Um, from the simulations that I ran, it is uh, I found that there's some amount of a shift in the loading that occurs from the outside muscles to the internal muscles. So that was kind of like a new finding. With respect to the shear forces that act on the spine, overall there's a reduction in the shear forces, which is great. But with respect to the compressive forces, if you look at the whole spine, you have different vertebrae. So I saw that there's some kind of shift between of loading that by the use of the exosuit, some of the loading on the lower back gets transferred to the upper back. That you can see from this figure here, especially in this one. The dotted line here represents the no exosuit condition, and this is T1, T2, which is like the vertebrae close to your neck, and L5, S1 is the vertebrae on the lower back, or this is like the tailbone almost. And this is kind of like goes along the spine, and the black dotted line shows that in the absence of the exosuit, you have a kind of uniformly increasing loading as you go from the top spine to the lower end of the spine. Whereas if you do use an exosuit, you see somewhat kind of an even loading, which means that it's distributing now the loading to the whole of the spine rather than just concentrating it at the lower back, like what happens here. Now, I'm not a person from biology, so I can't really say whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But the important thing is that now we know that these are the kind of things that happen. So to summarize this section, um, yeah, like during my PhD, I came up with two different designs of exosuits, and then I tried to model the interaction forces between the exosuit and the human, and then try to analyze how that would affect the muscle forces and so on. Now, there's several other future directions that can be possible in the future, uh, like lifting in dynamic condition. Like what I had checked was mostly static forward bending positions, but you can check, uh, you can do the same analysis also in a dynamic lifting task where someone is actually lifting something and putting on, let's say lifting from the ground and putting it on a table. When you have dynamic motions like this, you have additional inertial forces and additional forces in general. So it would be very interesting to check how dynamic lifting would be affected by exosuits. And of course, then it would be useful to validate the kind of results that we get by using EMG, which is again like measurement of the muscle activity of the muscles. Um, the last part, very short part, is now okay. Now we know how we can optimize the pneumatic system. Now we know how we can model soft wearable robots. Now, can we optimize the design and control of wearable soft robots? So basically, that's exactly what I'm trying to do during my postdoc. I say confidential because things are not published yet and we are trying for a patent and so on. But the main idea of this is, again, that you have musculoskeletal modeling and biomechanics based softwares in which you can model the exosuit, you can create some kind of parameters for the exosuit, and then test different parameter values and try to minimize some quantity. That could be, let's say, minimizing the amount of effort that you need to do a given task, or minimizing the amount of forces that are produced in a particular muscle group, and so on. So with that point, I would like to end my talk. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Sagar, for the wonderful presentation. Students and viewers of this event have a lot of curious questions that they seek answers for. I hope you can enlighten them. I encourage everyone to put their questions forward now.
Sir, I would like to thank you for keeping such an
Sagar.
okay, Sagar. Thank you for keeping such an amazing session. And so I had a few questions regarding soft robotics. In
Yeah,
the initial slide, you talked about flexible exoskeleton, right? So I
yeah.
wanted to know how can we make this exoskeleton lightweight and like cost effective? Because it's very important that it reaches the public, and these two are the basic necessities.
Yes. You mean exosuits, like the soft exosuits, or do you
Yeah,
mean the exoskeleton?
yeah,
Okay, so
exosuits.
by default, the kind of materials that you use for these kind of devices, they are like fabric-based nylon straps, or some kind of equipment that people use in climbing. So if you have gone climbing, or like, I forgot the name of that activity, but you have some kind of a harness that you wear, and these tools like carabiners or something, in which on how to attach yourself to a rope and so on. So many of these kinds of devices are kind of available easily in the market, and so to build a soft wearable device, it doesn't require too much money, so that's already really nice. There's different types of devices that you can build, different kind of actuation that you can build. So let me try to answer this in a simpler way. You have your structure of the device, and you have an actuation element. The structure of the device is the thing that binds itself to the body, and then the actuating device is the thing that generates the force. Uh, the binding material, the frame, structure by itself is very cheap usually, because you use fabric-based components. The actuation is the one which can be expensive, but in that case, you can use passive systems, which means like just kind of springs or elastic bands and so on, and then your device will be very cheap. If you want active devices, you will have to use some kind of motors, DC motors or BLDC and so on, or you can use pneumatic systems. But like, depending on the amount of forces that you need to apply, the cost of this will vary. But I would say, if you want to build something which is very affordable and for the general public, passive systems would be the way.
Sir, are these technologies like biodegradable?
Biodegradable depends on the material you use. So you have nylon straps and so on, and I think, I'm not sure if nylon is biodegradable or even if it is recyclable, but you can use hemp or something else. So it depends on the materials.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And how is actuators used in dynamic lifting? Because there is no, they provide support to it.
How are actuators used in dynamic lifting? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Let's take the example of this device. Um, in this case, you would just power your actuators to go to a certain pressure, and then as you bend forward, the actuators will kind of get squished, and they will apply some kind of force depending on how much they are squished. The more forward you bend, the more they will be squished, so you automatically get some kind of a proportional force with these actuators. If you have cable driven systems, you can do the same. You can control the amount of torque that you apply, or control the amount of force that you can apply just by using some kind of force sensing, or you can measure the current that is required to generate the force, and you can control that. So it's kind of, yeah, not pretty straightforward, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes.
So I mean, other things you can do is you can have sensors placed on the body, which kind of try to figure out what kind of activity the person is doing, and then based on that activity you can have a control system that will control how much forces are to be applied. So it will guess if person is bending forward to lift something, or if the person is moving, like putting his hand up to kind of like maybe lift a tool above his head and so on. And you could have IMUs, which measure the orientation of the hand and the body, and then try to use a control system that controls different actuators. I think that that would also be possible.
Yeah, got it.
Right.
One question, Sagar. This exosuits, they can be very revolutionary for people with paralysis, giving them mobility, even if it's for a certain extent. How viable is it for everyday life for people with paralysis?
So there are quite a few startup companies that have already started building devices for everyday use and for people with some kind of disabilities. The main challenge in using it for everyday life is one is like the control system. The control has to be very easy. So there's a lot of gloves that actually work really well. That you have a single button to say if you want to open the grasp or close the grasp, and then people can use that very easily. Sorry. Or the other option is to make these devices completely passive. Passive means unpowered, so they won't require any batteries, they won't require any sensors or control systems and so on. And that is also a very effective way.
All right. Can we combine it with something like a robotic skin uh, for the passive part?
Nice. Yeah, nice question. So for the passive part, it doesn't really make too much sense by combining it with a robotic skin, because the idea of robotic skin is generally to have some kind of sensing, uh, to give a sense of touch to the robot. But if you can't control anything with that sensing ability, then it doesn't make sense to have it in the first place. So I would couple it with an active device. And then with the active device, then yes, you can have some kind of control system.
All right. Thank you.
Saga, I have a question. The
Sure.
exosuits can change the medical industry, right? So, how far from here, from now on, does it seem that these exosuits will be available to the common people in need at affordable prices?
So there's a lot of questions in this question. Um, so usually now, coming from a very practical point of view, any kind of medical device that is to be allowed to the public has to go through a bunch of regulations and protocols defined by the government. So it has to be so in the US they have the FDA approval. So similar to that, we would require some kind of approval, which in which like there's a governing body that tests the device and then says that yes, okay, this is safe for use with humans. And I mean, for it is safe to use for the general public and so on. Um, and in that case, then you need to have mechanisms in place that make sure that it's very safe to use with users, so that it doesn't cause any kind of injuries. Um, and so it and I think there's already a couple of like startup based devices that have received FDA based approval, which are designed for very specific tasks. And then you can show that okay, these are safe to use, and then they can be used directly. How long it will take, it's again a matter of like there's different devices for different activities, so each of them will require a different approval. You can't say that if a glove is approved, doesn't mean that you can have another device for the elbow and you can use that directly. That's not possible. So it is a one per one basis.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Sagar. I'm Sardar, the Deputy Head of IIT Bombay. I want to
Sorry,
get
I can't hear you clearly. Your
uh,
mic has some distortion, I think.
one second. Is it better?
Yeah, this is better.
Yeah. Hi, Sagar. I'm Shauril. I'm the technical head of IEEE-RAS, and truly a great session. I wanted to get into the details of the electrical implementation inside these actuators, any soft actuators. So, do we have actual mechanical actuators pulling in the different forces, or fluid-based solutions that also exist? Like, basically, I wanted to know how we are using that pressure, manipulating that pressure that you talked about in the soft robotics part.
Oh, okay. Let me go way behind. Okay, so for soft robots, you have generally three kind of methods by which you can generate force. One is through pneumatics, which is the robots, which is the kind of actuators that I work with mostly. In that, there's a hollow cavity, which when you pressurize it, it expands and moves in some specific directions, and it generates some kind of motion and force. The other two types are with cable-driven systems, in which you have like generally a soft structure, and then you just pull a cable with a motor, and then the soft structure will move. And then the third is electroactive polymers or dielectric elastomers, in which again there's like a soft silicone body with some kind of capacitors inside, and when you power these capacitors, because of the voltage difference, the actuator, like the body of the device, deforms, in which way by which you can generate some kind of motion. um, Again, for the three mechanisms, you need different supporting systems. In the case of pneumatic systems, or in the case of pneumatic actuators, you generally need a compressor to generate the pressurized air. You need valves, which can direct the air to different actuators. And then you need pneumatic lines, which you can see in this figure. Does that answer your question, or do you need something more?
Yep, that answers my question.
Perfect.
Also, I wanted to ask if you can just give us a short demo on the OpenSim software that you told us about. Like, we really want to get into development of these software. Actually, we were planning on a mixed reality glass. For that, if you can give us some idea how that OpenSim software looks like.
Okay, let me share my screen. Stop. Can you see this? So, yeah, so OpenSim is this biomechanics based software. You can load different kind of models in it. Let's see. Oh, it's loading now.
Sir, OpenSim is free software or it's
Yeah, it's a completely open source software. Okay,
okay?
so now you can see this. You can see this thing on the left, where you have different things like ground, body, joints, forces, markers, and so on. In the bodies, you would have different bones. Okay, let me just hide the muscles first. So in the bodies, you have different bones, like you have the pelvis, sacrum, different sections. So you have section for the abdomen, for the five lumbar vertebrae. You have different ribs, radius ulnar, so that means your hands and so on. Yeah, I think this is a large model, so it's taking a bit of a time to hide the muscles. There's too many muscles. But anyway, the idea of this is that basically this is what we call as a physics engine, which means it has, like, it has a ground, it has gravity, and it basically more helps to model multi-body rigid body systems. So now you'd see a skeleton, but you can also model something like a slider crank mechanism or a four-bar mechanism and so on. Now this guy has it's nice. The different bones that you see correspond to different bodies. Each of them are connected at joints. So this is, for example, the shoulder joint and so on. And then here you have different coordinates with which you can change things. So let me just move the arm a little bit. So you can see that now the arm can move by controlling this dial. So what you generally do with this is that you load a kind of model, and then you load a specific type of file known as the kinematics file, which creates like a trajectory for each of these degrees of freedom. And so when you load that into it, the skeleton will um, move in a particular pattern, depending on what kind of motion you give it. And then it has lots of muscles. So let me just have some muscles there. Yeah. So these are the muscles of the chest, which are the pectoral muscles. And as you move the arm up, yeah, as you move the arm, you can see that the muscles are also moving along with that. So they are kind of like attached to different bodies and so on. And then you could load different motion files in this and try to use the built-in tools that this has to calculate what will be the muscle forces required in order to move in this way. So you would find all of that in this tools section. So I would say that if you guys are interested, then just search for OpenSim, musculoskeletal, OpenSim and biomechanics, and you would get a lot of resources. This is fully free. You can download it and start working on it like today. And you will also find lots of nice
Thank you.
tutorials
Yeah,
on YouTube.
yeah. I was googling it by side by side. Thank you so much. It is very similar to ANSYS simulation environment. Yeah, it would be easier for us to adapt to the software.
You guys are using something else?
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's very similar to the ANSYS simulation environment, so it would be
ANSYS.
easier for, yeah, for the mechanical stuff. So it also has controls in the joint space. So
Okay. Yeah, I mean, ANSYS is much more like, let's say, diverse in the kind of things that it can do, because it's used for finite element analysis and so on. This doesn't have finite
exactly.
element analysis, but you have
Yeah, I was saying
things like
that it will be easier for us to port.
sorry.
It would be easier for us to adapt to this OpenSim as well. It's very similar.
Possibly, yeah. It's generally decently easy to use for basic things. If you want to do a lot more fancier things, then yeah, you require to spend some amount of time.
Right. Thank you so much, Sagar.
One more question. Exoskeletons and exosuits can be used for military load carriage, I guess. So, can we just come up with a compatible design and material so that these can have applications in military as well?
That's already happening, especially in the US. Uh, so the main difference between different applications is mainly the amount of forces that you apply. If you're assisting someone with some kind of physical disability, then usually you just need to apply some amount of force so that the person can do this particular task. And the kind of application is also usually different. Then like for people with, say, cerebral palsy, they would require some kind of assistance on the ankle. For people with some other kind of, say, spinal cord injury, if they don't have control over their arm, that they can't move, they can't grasp strong enough, then you would just require a glove which can help to open and close the wrist. The magnitude of forces that you need in these applications is usually less. Whereas for military-based applications, or what we call as enhancing-based applications, you would require much higher forces. So usually, those systems are kind of made with more durable materials, stronger materials, and definitely stronger actuators, so that you have higher forces that you can apply. But otherwise, by like essentially, it's the same thing at the end.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have
Hi
already
Sagar,
30
this
minutes.
is Yukmita and I have a question too.
Sure.
So I had read about that some exoskeletons they orient themselves to that of insects, especially they orient themselves according to the fiber orientation as well as the load, and they adjust the strain also, like stiffness according to the fiber orientation. Can we reduce a similar kind of flexibility and compatibility in human models? And if so, is it possible to utilize them for muscle therapy? Like in human models, is it possible to utilize exoskeletons for muscle therapy and regain muscle function?
I'll answer the second question first because I understood that well. I'm not sure I understood the first question, but we can come back to that again. The again, there's already lots of devices that work on like physiotherapy using wearable assisted devices. One very simple example is for people who have either frozen shoulder or some kind of let's say disability of one of the shoulder. You have a device that has two arms. You wear one of them in one of your arm and then the other in the other arm, and then you use your intact or your healthy shoulder to move in different ways, and then the other side of the robot, it just shadows the motion of this one, and so it will move you accordingly. And that kind of helps you to at least gain some kind of mobility, to actually help in recovering lost function. Now that's a more complex problem because like in the initial phases, it's like the amount of support that you give to the person has to kind of change over time. In the beginning, if the person can't move at all, you have to provide some amount of assistance, but at the end it should be the person who should do more of the motion and the device should do less, so that the muscles are encouraged kind of to move by themselves. So this is like a whole different field by itself of how you can control devices for physiotherapy or something like that.
Right.
But it has been used and it is being used already.
Okay. So coming back to my first question, that was on if suppose I have read that exoskeleton of insects they adjust to the strain or the load by changing the thickness, stiffness, and fiber orientation. Those particular models. So can the similar kind of flexibility and compatibility can be introduced in terms of human models? If you're designing a human model or a human exoskeleton, can we expect that it can arrange itself in terms of thickness, stiffness, or in kind of orientation depending on the condition?
Um, okay, and I'm not fully sure I understand your question. So in insects, you say that fiber angles change, and that changes what?
Like the entire orientation. So the exoskeleton becomes better equipped to support the insect in question on particular given condition.
Okay, so you're kind of talking about a kind of a reconfigurable system which can
Yeah,
move in
yeah.
different ways to assist different kind of motions. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. I don't think there's too much work done in that yet, but there are some labs who are kind of like working on these kind of reconfig. Like my PhD supervisor and like my PhD, the lab where I did my PhD, we were thinking of having some kind of devices which were origami based. So it's like it is a flat structure with a lot of folding elements within it, and then depending on how you fold it, you can get different shapes. Um, and in that, you could kind of put it on different parts of the body, and that can align itself to the person, and then you can change the stiffness in that. Um, Although, yeah, it is still in the research phase. So I would say, to answer your question, some people are working on that, but we haven't seen much progress yet because people have started very recently on this.
Okay,
But
that's great to hear.
generally, yeah, but generally, yes, you can change stiffness and then create different functionalities in the device.
Okay. Thank you so much.
So it's 10 p.m. now, I think there. So what's the timeline for today?
Sagar, I think we shall end the meeting now because I think it was 10 p.m. when we were supposed to
Okay.
do that. Thank you so much, Sagar, for joining us. It was a very articulate and insightful presentation. We look forward to you as an inspiration and also for your guidance in future. Thank you so much for being here and for the event.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and seems like a nice event. I hope you guys keep working on things like this in the future. And best of luck to everyone, whoever is planning on pursuing further studies ahead and so on. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, sir.